when I got into grade 9 in high school, I kind of just made this decision that I was going to surround myself with all of the people and all of the behaviors that I knew God would hate, because I was just so angry at God. And I think I never really doubted that God was real, but I was just so angry at him, and I held so much bitterness in my heart that it was almost like I wanted to prove to God, like I wanted to make God hurt or make my family hurt. And so I just ran in grade 9, started to mess around with drugs, started to get involved with parties and stuff like that. And then slowly over time, that stuff began to just increase, and I just tried to distance myself from the upbringing that I had. At somewhere along the line, I was always really musical, and so I loved always writing music, and I was doing that even from when I was like a young kid. I would just like come up with songs and things like that. But in high school at the time, death metal was super popular, and I got into the death metal scene, and I joined a band in high school and continued in that scene all throughout high school. And so like fast forward after high school, when I was about 18, 19, I was looking at actually a career in death metal music, and I'd gotten really good at screaming. I was the vocalist for a band, and we were doing like pretty good, like locally we were pretty good, and I was getting pretty good at screaming and was starting to get connected to different people and all this kind of stuff. So that was looking like it was gonna be my career at the time. And but all in that scene, there's just such a heavy fascination with darkness, and so I would be watching horror movies, and I almost had like a horror movie addiction where I'd be watching horror movies like almost every day, or I'd be studying up on like weird like witchcraft stuff and like just dark like things in history, and I would be writing lyrics out of these things. And part of the experience, although I didn't go into any sort of like official witchcraft like practices or whatever, what I started to do when I'd write lyrics, and I was usually high and doing drugs and stuff like that, but I would start to like channel this energy, and I would feel something actually come over my body, and I would slip into almost these like trances, and I'd start writing lyrics, and I'd just be like inspired to create these death metal songs and things like that. And I started having these experiences more and more where I'd start to slip into almost these out of body experiences. And at first it felt really good. It felt like, I had this like power, and I guess you could call it like astral projection or something like that, but that wasn't really my categories for it. But I started to like go and have these out of body experiences or feel this power. And I felt like sometimes when I was doing these death metal shows, and I'd be screaming lyrics that were like very overtly satanic, but I felt like I had like power over people in the audience, and I could like control and manipulate things, and cause fear and things like that in people. And then over time, like what began to happen was, so at first these spiritual kind of experiences I was having felt good. And I felt kind of powerful, and I felt like intimidating. And obviously I think I struggled with a lot of insecurity, especially being bullied as a little kid. I felt like I wanted to distance myself from that and kind of be like a tough guy or whatever. And it felt good to have power and to like fight people and things like that. And then what ended up happening though is that those feelings that I had ended up turning on me. And when I was 19 years old, I felt like I had a total mental breakdown. And there were so many things that started happening in my life at this point in time, but I started to just experience like crazy nightmares, and just like very vivid nightmares, and had experiences where in my room, like my door would slam shut in the middle of the night, and my CD player would turn on at full volume in the middle of the night and just start blaring death metal music for no apparent reason. And I would have all these weird experiences, and then just feel like I felt this like evil presence. And then when I started doing drugs or things like that, I started to have like extreme paranoia that there was like voices in my head and people following me and things like that. So I ended up cutting out the drugs, and I thought, okay, man, I've burnt my mind. Like, so I'm not going to like smoke weed anymore. I'm not going to do drugs anymore. And I cut out all that stuff, but the paranoia and the feeling in my mind just kind of kept getting worse and worse and worse. And often what would happen in that 19th year of my life is I would black out and I would go into these fits of rage, and I would start fighting people, and I'd start going crazy, and it was almost like I would come to and not even know what happened, and or I'd have a conversation with somebody, and it felt like my body was almost on autopilot. Like I was having a conversation, but I didn't feel like I was the one at the steering wheel of my life. I felt like something else was controlling my life, and I didn't really have language for it. So I started looking into like mental health, and I was like, maybe I'm bipolar, maybe I'm schizophrenic, maybe I burnt my brain on drugs, and this is like, I'm going to be, this is how it's going to be for me moving on. But I had a few experiences leading up to the moment where I encountered Jesus that really, I just started recognizing like my desperate need for God again. And he started waking me up to the fact of, I just was desperate for him. I needed him, and I needed freedom in my life. But one of these experiences that I had was, I was with my girlfriend, who is now my wife, but she was my girlfriend at the time, and neither of us were walking with the Lord. But I remember I was taking a selfie with her, and I took a selfie in my phone, and then I looked at the picture, and in the picture my face looked like the character from the movie Scream, but the face that's all stretched out and long and sad kind of thing. And my face was like all distorted and weird looking, and her face was fine. And so I just thought, oh man, that's weird. There's probably something on the lens of the camera. So I like rubbed off my camera lens, took it again, another selfie, and my face looked exactly the same, but like twisted even in almost a different way, and like sad and like dark eyes and a long mouth. And then I was like, oh, that's weird. And so I flipped the camera the other way to see maybe it'll affect her face, Sylvia's face, if I flip the camera around and take it another way. And every single time, I think I tried 4 times, my face came out distorted every time, and her face was completely fine. And I remember in that moment, all of a sudden this fear came over me, and I was like, okay, what is going on right now? And I remember feeling this feeling, and I know now that it was God's voice, but I remember having this thought enter my mind of, this is what you look like on the inside. And on the outside, you're trying to pretend that everything's okay, but this is what you look like inside. And this experience like really freaked me out. And I was like, oh my goodness, I need help. Like there's something wrong with my life. And in addition to that, the last thing I'd say about that whole experience was, I felt like I was a prisoner in my own mind. And I felt like for years, I just felt like I was almost, the only way I can describe it is I was like strapped to a chair in the back of my head, but I felt like I was watching life happen to me, but I felt like I had no real control over my life. And I felt like, just like I was on autopilot, and I just felt like the only way to describe it was I was a prisoner in the back of my mind, and something else had taken over. And I got so desperate, and I was at this point having thoughts of like taking my own life, and I just got super freaked out about this whole experience. And then I got invited to a church one night, and I just knew, I had this feeling in my heart, which again was God's voice, but I just felt this feeling that if I don't get to this church tonight, then something horrible is going to happen to me. Like this is a life or death kind of situation. I got to get to this church tonight. And it was a crazy thing even getting to the church that night. So on the way to the church, even my brother, who wasn't doing good at the time too, he was involved in drugs and drinking a lot, and was just like living a very destructive lifestyle. But randomly, my mom was going to drive me to this place that night, and my brother said, "Oh yeah, I'll come to the church too." And my mom was like, "Oh, okay, that's cool." And so we jumped in the car, and then like on our way to the church, my brother started having this big anger episode, where this rage fit, where he started kind of yelling and getting mad and freaking out and swearing and whatever else. And then we pull up to a red light, and he opened the door, and he jumped out of the car and just took off in the middle of the city. And it was just this crazy thing. And I felt desperate in my heart when he was doing this. I was like, Mom, like we have to get to the church. Like you have to get me to the church. And like, so she just shut the door, and we just kept driving, and we just ignored whatever my brother was going through. And then we got to the church. And when I got to the church, and again, like this next moment, my background, like in our family's background, like we had never heard a lot about spiritual warfare or demons. And like, I think growing up, we knew that that was real. We had read the Bible and we knew that that was something that was out there, but we never really imagined that our situation could have been like, that this could have actually been demonic. Like, it just wasn't a part of my family's framework or the church background that we experienced. And so when I got to the church that night, I kind of went in, I had a black hoodie, I think probably with like, I think all my hoodies at the time had like, you know, death metal hoodies with like skulls and stuff. And I remember like pulling my hood up and like sitting in the back of the church. And I can't remember anything that happened during the service, but I just remember like any of the speaking or anything like that. But when I was in the back of the room, I remember I just started shaking and almost like passing out. And I had to grab the chair in front of me at some points because I was fainting. I thought I was going to fall out of my chair. And it was such a strange experience, and I had no clue what was going on. And it was all freaking me out. My mom is just sitting beside me and just praying and just like crying out to God, like asking him to do a miracle. And then at the end of the service, a pastor got up on the stage, and he just like got up and he said, you know, I think the Holy Spirit has given me a word for somebody here tonight. And he said, there's someone here tonight, and you're sitting here and you feel like you're a prisoner in your own mind. And Jesus wants to come and he wants to set you free tonight. And when he said that word, like it was like a knife hit me right in the heart. Like, and I knew that it was God speaking directly to me. Like, it was the perfect words to describe exactly how I felt. And in that moment, I'm still like sitting in the chair and I'm like shaking and I feel like I'm gonna pass out. And I just prayed in my heart. I couldn't even open my mouth to say the words. But I just prayed in my heart. I said, Jesus, like, I said, Jesus, like, if you're actually real, and like, if you would heal me, I will give you the rest of my life. And then it was just an honest prayer from my heart. And then in that next moment, I don't even know really what happened, but I remember feeling like it was almost like these hands came down my back, and it felt like all of a sudden I was struck by electricity. And I shot up out of my chair, and I just like ran to the front of this church, and I just collapsed at the front of this church and started crying and just like begging the pastors, begging someone to help me. And I made a big scene of the place, and which I didn't care about in the moment. I was just so desperate. And then the pastor, they ended up taking me to the side of the church and at the front there, and the pastor began to say, like, you know, Curtis, have you ever heard of spiritual warfare and demons? And in that moment, I knew, I was like, okay, yeah, whatever I'm experiencing, this is demonic, and it clicked for me. But then the next moment, the pastor, he got another word of knowledge where he heard from the Spirit, and he said, Curtis, like, and he didn't know me. He said, Curtis, I'm just hearing from God that you've given rights to the kingdom of darkness to your throat. Does that make any sense to you? And I was like, and he didn't know I was a death metal screamer. He didn't know any of that. And that I'd been screaming these satanic lyrics. And then of course, yes, that was true. But when he said that, as soon as he said that word, I felt this like hand grab my throat, and I started choking and coughing and like violently reacting to what he was saying. I was shaking, like it was very, very intense. And then he commanded, he started saying, I can't remember a lot of it, honestly. At this point, it was so intense that I wasn't even really sure what was going on. But he just said, like, you know, the blood of Jesus down your throat. And I remember just coughing and sputtering, and then this other voice took over my mouth and started speaking out of my mouth and saying all kinds of things that I thankfully don't remember. But I just remember the experience was very, very intense. And then so they started doing deliverance and commanding spirits to leave me. And then all the while in my heart, while this is going on, it's very intense, it's very full on, but in my heart, I'm just like crying and just like thinking like, oh my goodness, like I was getting so hit by the love of God. And I was just like, man, God, like I deliberately, like I knew who you were. And like I knew the Bible, and I knew the gospel, and I knew what you did for me on the cross, and I deliberately slapped you in the face. And I I allowed evil spirits to come into my life and to control my life, and yet you still love me and you're still setting me free. And it's like in that moment, I just repented and my heart just fully changed, and I just realized just how much God loved me and just like his mercy for me. And basically over the next couple weeks, I went through this deliverance process with this church where I was just renouncing all of these things that I had been involved in my life. And I got set free. I don't know how many demons, but it was quite a lot of spirits just kept coming out of me over the course of a few weeks. And then, but I was completely free, and it changed my entire life. And even after that first night, like I was a completely different person. And all that feeling of being trapped in the back of my mind, it was like, I remember walking out of the church and like, I just was like staring at my hands, and I was just like feeling, and I was like, it felt like there was this blip in my life where I was a boy and I felt like connected and I felt whole. And then it was like this blip of darkness in my life. And then all of a sudden it was like, I felt like a little boy again. And I felt like I could feel my hands and I could like see, and I was present and my mind was clear and there wasn't this like storm. And it's just like, I remember too walking out of the church and just being like how quiet it was. It was like I was in the midst of this storm with all these waves in my head my entire life. And then I remember walking out of that church and being like, I felt like life was just like this crystal clear lake, and everything was so calm. And it was like, honestly, the silence was overwhelming in my head. Like I was like, didn't know it could be that quiet. And I was completely healed. And after that, like all of the anger problems just fell off my life. All of the struggles that I had with lust, they just fell off my life. And I just like all the drug problems that I had, it just stopped. And because I was so shocked into life, and I just realized like, oh my goodness, like Jesus loved me and he gave his life for me and even healed me when I was like deliberately rebelling against him. And I don't ever want to experience this demonic junk in my life again. And the experience it changed my entire life. And then, yeah, it's been an amazing journey ever since then. I left all the death metal scene. I left all those bands, and I turned from that. And after that moment, I just realized I was like, all I want to do for the rest of my life is just tell people about Jesus. And so that's what I get the opportunity to do now. And I get to be in ministry and tell people about Jesus. And then by God's grace in my life, like through that experience, he's also used me to help see other people get set free from demonic stuff. And that's one of the main ways that God uses me in ministry today.